Alrighty, everybody. I want to take a look at a game I just recently played, but before I do that, I wanted to mention my rating. So, number one, I'm very happy that my rating has kind of over the history been going up, but if you look here right here at the end, it has been dropping. And if you look over here, progression over the last 12 games, my rating is going down, which means I'm losing games. But that's okay. This happens to coincide with the time when I am practicing a new opening. So I'm learning lessons. And as we say in the software world, fail fast, right? The idea behind fail fast is that you can quickly move off of a failing strategy onto hopefully a successful strategy. But also, more importantly than that, you can take the lessons you learned, because you do learn lessons, right? When you make mistakes or you pick a wrong path, you do learn lessons. And then by failing fast, you can then quickly apply those lessons to the next iteration much sooner. So I'm failing a lot in my chess games. But hopefully I am then applying those lessons to my next games. And I'm staying positive, I'm staying upbeat about it, because I can't remember if we talked about this or not, but this is my fake account, right? So I made this account with a fake name, specifically knowing that at some point in time I'm going to throw this away, start a real account. I'm air quoting here. Start a real account. And then that way, this account is my learning account. I can use this account. I can screw up as much as I want in this account, and I don't care what my rating is. Psychologically, that allows me to not be too upset when I lose games, because, hey, at any point in time, I can throw this away and I can go use my real name, and I'm not having a bad rating on my real name. So I'm not stressing about keeping my rating high because, oh, I've got to look good in front of people. Like, I don't have to worry about that. That's what this fake name is for. Now, granted, and I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before, I'm going to keep this name. Like, I'm not going anywhere because the history of this thing shows, like, it's kind of cool to be able to see that from the beginning of time of me playing chess, like, you could see my rating, and you can see the time that I stopped playing rapid games and focused on other formats. But, like, you can see this cool, like, progression, and so I want to keep it. But when you see these dips, and you're gonna see these dips of me failing, like if I'm just playing normal games and I'm playing long enough, like, it should maintain steady, right? This is a nice long steady path of me going up and down, up and down, up and down, but staying steady because I'm playing against people who are rated around the same as me. And according to rating, I should win some, I should lose some, I should draw some, and it should all kind of work out even. I do have spikes that go up. That's where I have finally started to apply lessons I've learned and make better choices. And then I'm going to have spikes where I drop. And in this case, this drop coincides with me learning a new opening, which we're going to talk about. So I'm going to be right back when I'm going to look at the game. All right? All right, are we back? We're back. Okay. So this is the game that I just got finished playing a few minutes earlier. And I wanted to take a look at it after the fact. The reason I wanted to look at it after the fact is because during the opening, my opponent played e4. And I was excited because I get to play our friend knight f6, the Alekhine. So our guy Alekhine is back on the board, and I was really excited about this. My opponent snapped this d3 move. Now, if you look at the clock, the first move, you have 30 seconds to make your first move. The idea is it allows people to connect into the game, settle in before making a decision, so you don't run out of clock. If your opponent happens to move really fast the first move or whatever, before you're even, like, connected into the game. You don't lose clock while you're still connecting. So you've got 30 seconds to make the first move, and my opponent did not, they must have had it pre-moved. So my opponent used 0 clock, not even a single second moving this move. It was so fast that it was a pre-move. So my opponent had this opening pre-moved, and I don't know if they were anticipating me making this knight f6 move, the Alekhine. I waited a considerable period of time to see if my opponent wanted to ask for a takeback. I even asked my opponent at the time if they wanted the takeback. They never responded. So I continued. So I did waste a lot of time on my first move, or my second move, I should say. If you look down here, 9:20, so 40 seconds. Like I said, most of that was me waiting for my opponent to see if they wanted to ask for a takeback, if maybe they had accidentally pre-moved this and was not expecting the Alekhine. All right, that being said, I don't know this variation. This is one of the variations I have not talked about. The Maroczi variation. I don't know this variation, but we don't have to know it. I made a standard developing move because, like I said, I had waited a long enough time trying to see if my opponent wanted to take back. In this case, what I should have done, right? We know what happens if your opponent plays knight c3. We push d5, and we go into the Scandinavian, asking my opponent if they want to capture or asking if they want to push past. And if they push past, we have a hidey hole, so we're safe. I should have continued in that mindset when my opponent pushed d3, because this does basically the same thing. It develops, right? So it's open up his dark square bishop. He's getting and defending, so he's doing two things. So I could have easily challenged the center and seen if my opponent wants to capture or push past. So I just made a standard developing move. My opponent made a developing move that was somewhat questionable in my mind. c3 probably would have been better because this pawn push, I think, was to open up this dark square bishop, and now it's stuck at home. But that's okay. Maybe he's rerouting this knight somewhere else. You know, maybe he wants to bring it here, or maybe he wants to bring it here to put defense along the square. I don't know, but my opponent is rerouting his knight. At this point in time, I remember my notes. I go into a modified Scandinavian and ask my opponent if he's going to push past or if he's going to capture. My opponent develops. So at this point in time, I'm waiting a few seconds because I want to make a decision. We know that in some variations where exchanges take place, and this is lots of different openings, when exchanges take place right in front of your opponent's king and queen, what can happen is an early queen trade. If an early queen trade happens, my queen is defended by a knight, and therefore I can capture back and maintain castling privileges. My opponent does not have that privilege. The only thing defending his queen is his king, so if there's an early queen trade, he gives up castling privileges. So this is what I decided to go for. I went for the trade. My opponent took back with a knight instead of the pawn, which is fine. It's kind of like daring me. It's like, hey, are you really going to make this exchange? Are you sure you want to do it? Because if you don't, I'm going to mess up your pawn structure. So I decided to continue on with my plan, make the early trade, and it just so happens that it lines up that I'm the one that gets to make the decision on how we trade, and my opponent has to give up castling privileges. So that is the one thing. I feel like it's a small victory. We are equally in material. We're equal in material. We each have one piece developed. My opponent has a pawn in the center of the board, but I can still castle. They can't. I feel like that's a fair trade. I continue with an e5 push, or this e5 pawn does two things for me. Actually, three things if you think about it. Number one, I just don't want to allow my opponent to continue pushing this pawn. I want to make sure that I have some defenders that I can get to it, and that those defenders can be in good shape. Plus, if I fianchetto on this side, I can get a second attacker on it. I don't anticipate coming all the way out this way, obviously, because there's a threat here, and my opponent's already moved their king out of the way, so I can't really pin this pawn. So I don't really anticipate that, but by locking this pawn in place, I can now also open both of my bishops. So that's the reason I decided to go e5 instead of just e6. Probably the engines say that e6 is better. I don't know. But that was my thought process, is I'm going to go e5. I'm going to open up both of my bishops, and I am fully prepared to continue this game. Here's my first mistake. My knight is pinned. My knight is defending this pawn. I have just opened up my dark square bishop. I'm about to move my dark square bishop. I need to defend this pawn. My opponent has removed the defender of the pawn, but they're still attacking it. So I move my bishop, but I don't put it where it should go. It should most definitely go right here defending this pawn. My opponent captures a free pawn. So they're up a pawn. I'm still okay because I'm ready to castle. But there's another thing. My opponent has two attackers, and I only have one defender. So now this is not a mistake. This is a conscious decision. I saw this. And I know that if I do nothing, my opponent can capture, I capture back, and capture, and they win a pawn. So, is my opponent willing to sacrifice a knight to take my knight and my pawn? You betcha he probably is. I could defend it, right? That's totally possible, a legal, valid move for me to defend this knight. But that would then allow my opponent to trade away my light square bishop and do what in the process? Force me to capture back with my king, which gives up castling privileges. Is that worth it to me? Is a pawn, actually it'd be this pawn, is a pawn worth it to me? I don't know. I'm already down one pawn by my own mistake. I decide, you know what, it's worth it. I'm going to go ahead and castle. I'm going to give up the B pawn and just take that as, you know what, I've got my rooks connected. My light square bishop is still free to do a lot of work. My opponent will have a bishop pair. I'll have a bishop pair. My opponent will have 2 extra pawns. All right, that's a tough pill to swallow, but it's okay. Here's where things get a little funny. I don't know if my opponent either missed it, that he had 2 attackers and I only had 1 defender, or if he was trying to set up some kind of trap or something. I'm not sure. But this is the time my opponent makes a slight mistake. He should, I believe, honestly, my opponent should have gone for the second free pawn. Because right now, my opponent still only has 1 pawn up. Okay, yes, my dark square bishop is undefended. There's a couple options here. Number 1, I can just straight up trade. And then my opponent can still make this trade, right? And we've simply traded away bishops, and I'm down another pawn. Is that worth it or not? I don't know. My opponent's king is still in the middle of the board. His pawns become separated. He would have 3 separate pawn islands. Granted, I would have 3 separate pawn islands too. So I don't know. The other thing I could do is I could drop my bishop back. If my opponent wants to trade, that's fine. And we can oops. If my opponent wants to trade here, that's fine. And then I can open up my rook. Is that worth it? Possibly. Because, you know, number 1, my opponent can't castle. So if they want to get their rooks involved, they're going to have to do some pawn pushing. And so maybe this open, you know, A file, maybe that becomes interesting. I decide against both of those tactics, and I go for a third tactic, which is probably the worst of the tactics. So we already know that I have material on the board in jeopardy. So what's the best way to fix that problem? Put more material in jeopardy. Duh. No, this is not a good choice. Notice, I could have even captured the undefended knight, allowed my opponent to capture the undefended bishop, and allowed my opponent to stay just 1 pawn up. Right, so my knight is no longer pinned, so why don't I just make this exchange? All right, so that gives up the bishop pair, but it means I'm only down 1 pawn. But I decided to go for this. Now, the only defender of this bishop is this knight, which, as we've plainly stated, is already attacked twice. So all my opponent has to do is, let's say, capture. And then this is an undefended bishop. So now I'm forced to either make the trade here, and my opponent still can now walk away, going up. Let's look at this. Capture, capture. So we're back even. I mean, he's still up a pawn. And then capture, capture, maybe, I guess. Like, that could happen where he's still up a pawn, but now our pawns are all screwed up. I don't know. The safest bet for my opponent, maybe even something like this. And then what do? Maybe take a pawn? I don't know. Like, it does not seem like a very good, solid plan. Right, my opponent. Anyway, let's get out of that mindset, because trying to figure out why I screwed up is well, figuring out why my mindset was incorrect. It's not going to help me if I continue to chase that incorrect mindset. So I'm going to throw that incorrect mindset away. I have put more material in jeopardy, and my opponent simply, all he has to do is continue this plan and pick up a free pawn. My opponent captures this way, which allows me to capture back this way. So my opponent goes, bishop captures on d4, so I just use my knight, which was under attack, to capture on d4. Now, I'm definitely not going to capture this way, because that gives my opponent a free piece. But now I have wiggled my knight out of the way. It's no longer under attack. All right, so we've saved our pawn. So we got a little lucky there that my compounded mistake didn't hurt me because my opponent also made a mistake. So now my opponent defends his pawns, adds another defender, which is perfectly fine. I need to get developed. There's not a lot of squares. Oops, there's not a lot of squares my bishop can go to. Right, those are all taken away. These are all taken away. So if I want to get my bishop developed, there's one square to go to, and it's a defended square, so that's perfectly acceptable. My opponent challenges my knight. And are you ready, friends? What do we do when someone challenges your material, especially if it's undefended? We just remove it, right? This would have been a great move, a great opportunity to slide my knight back. My opponent's knight is still undefended, so they're going to have to retreat it. Or if they capture, that's fine, right? We've got that square defended, and then we can take the open b file. But no, in the moment, Joe goes, aha, I'm down a whole pawn, so an even trade, which loses me another pawn, that's got to be the way to go. Now, there is a small tactic here in that if my opponent captures, I capture back, and then they capture my pawn, I capture their pawn on f2. So my rook infiltrates to the second row. Now, why is that important? Well, a rook on the second row becomes a hungry pig. Notice it locks the king from coming onto the board, so it forces my opponent's rooks to never be connected. That becomes a pretty big deal. So, yes, I know I am losing a pawn in this trade, but I'm activating a rook. So I go for it. That was my plan. That's what I went after. My opponent captures. I capture back. My opponent is up 2 full pawns, but they are isolated doubled pawns. I snag a pawn and activate my hungry pig. There are 2 pawns I'm immediately eyeing up. My opponent cannot save both of them. It can try to save one, but not both. In this case, my opponent decides to attack my rook. Well, my rook's not going anywhere. So hungry pig is hungry pig devours. I love that phrase, by the way. I love that. I don't know where it came from. One of these days I'll have to look up the history of that phrase. But rooks on the second row or the 7th, right, from the other side of the board. Whoever invented the phrase hungry pig, it's the best phrase. It really is. I'm sure it has some kind of translation thing where, you know, it's gobbling up pawns like a hungry pig for truffles or something. I don't know. I'm sure it has some kind of history like that. But what a fun phrase, right? A hungry pig. Anyway, so my pig is hungry. My pig is gobbling up pawns. My opponent quickly defends, right? So the base of this chain is defended. This pawn is defended. This pawn is defended. So my opponent has defended the rest of their pawns. But now our pawns, if we look at it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, our pawns are even. My hungry pig has picked up those 2 extra pawns, and now we're even. And not only are we even, my opponent's got some serious targets here in the center of the board. These isolated doubled pawns, perfect targets for a rook to maybe get around and start targeting them because they can't go anywhere. I immediately start, I've got 3 pawns on the queen side. My opponent has only 1, so that's going to be an advantage. Question, do we capture here? Or I should say, do I capture here now that this pawn is undefended and allow my opponent to gobble? In this case, I said no. I decided to defend. Now, my opponent probably should go back here and defend their undefended pawn, which he does, right? But we are even in material. I am looking at picking up a pawn, so trading, that wouldn't be so bad, would it? We trade, I pick up a pawn, and now I'm up a pawn. That can't be that bad. My opponent's king is completely exposed. There is nothing for him to hide behind. He's going to have to keep running. And notice he can't even hide. Like with my rook on the second rank, my opponent can't even get out of the way of his rook to get his rook over and help defend. He would have to bring his rook here move it up, and then tuck underneath just to get his rooks developed. So this rook is kind of dead in the water for now, just for now. So making this trade could be a good thing. Oh, wait. You guys see a tactic here? Yeah, I missed it. So this is a tactic that I should have seen coming a mile away. Opponent, now the king has to move, and we gobble up a free rook. Yeah, I missed that. I saw the free pawn, so I picked up the free pawn. So I missed this tactic, and I'm mad at myself for missing the tactic. But I'm up a whole pawn. My rook is still cutting off my opponent's king. My pawns are all defended. So it's basically this rook versus this rook. Or I should say this rook versus this rook. Who can get into the game? Because this guy really, I mean... Okay, so I've got some rooks I can start attacking. I got some pawns I can start attacking with my rook, which I immediately do, right? My opponent finally gets his other rook into the game, defending his advanced e-pawn. I would love to have my rook. If my rook were here on the third row and I could get here, put a check. Well, this rook is defending right now, but you get the idea here in a second. Let me show you. First, let's move this rook out of the way. My opponent now has... anyway, the idea was if I could get this check, capture a pawn, and have now two rooks attacking this pawn, that would be good. So that was kind of in the back of my mind, but mostly I just wanted to have both my rooks connected, right? And have my rooks connected along this, where these two doubled pawns are, would be ideal because it's hard to defend those doubled pawns. Either way, my opponent's rook is a target, so we push the opponent's rook out of the way a little. Oh, yeah, I forgot. This backwards pawn is undefended, so my opponent doesn't even have time to defend everything. Has to move. That still becomes undefended, and notice he can't even go here to defend it because my pawn is guarding. So I now have gobbled up another pawn. So now I'm up two whole pawns. Excellent move by my opponent to attack my backward pawn, but I have a simple way to defend that. Push a pawn. So now this structure is pretty solid. And now I'm really looking at this doubled pawn, right? There's got to be a way that maybe I can get in here, get around behind, and really would be nice to get this other rook doubled up. But wait, there's more. Do you guys see the tactic? There's another tactic here. Are you guys looking for tactics? I hope you are, because I hope you see the tactic. This is a great learning opportunity. Check. Pick up a free rook. Twice I missed this. So twice I missed that my opponent's rook is in line with his king, and there's nothing stopping me from picking it up. So I simply defended my backwards pawn, made sure my opponent can't get his rook in here. The simple goal of re-maneuvering, right, to get into attacking this backwards pawn. My opponent now has no way of defending this backwards pawn. So I quickly gobble it up. But that does give my opponent now a chance to, well, it gives my opponent a chance to get their rook behind my backwards pawn. So that is something I need to be considerate of. And my opponent probably should have made this move first. Immediately challenge this, but I guess it really doesn't work because capture. Yeah, maybe it would work. And now my pawns are targets, right? So maybe that's what the plan should have been for my opponent. My opponent maneuvered to attack my rook, but I just saw you what my goal was. I now have two attackers in this pawn. My opponent doesn't have enough defenders, cannot add another defender here. Hell, this rook is under attack, so what's the best way to defend? My opponent really, this rook is trapped. It can't go here, it can't go here, it can't get out of its own way, can't capture, so he has to take back. So this was a pretty easy decision. Now my opponent gets over here, but because they wasted a tempo, one single king move, just one single move that they unfortunately lost tempo, gives me the opportunity to defend this pawn. So now my backwards pawn is defended. this is an okay move. I don't know what the goal here for this is. If these pawns were in this structure, this rook would be really good, because then you can't save all three, right? If my pawns were like this, and the opponent's rook here in the center, I can push one out of the way, but the backwards pawn is still a target. And then it doesn't matter which one I push out of the way, the backwards one is still a target. Or if I try to chase, a runaway, right? So there's no, if the pawns were in this formation, this rook tucked in between all three of them would be pretty good, because you're guaranteed to get one of the two defensive pawns. In the way it is now, though, all three of my pawns are safe. This rook can't do anything. Can't capture, because all I have to do is defend the base of the chain, and this pawn does a good job of defending both of these. My opponent, at this point in the game, cannot give up on his rook to try to break up this chain. Just can't do it. My rook would be way too strong with cutting off the king from these two pawns. So time to get my king into the game. My opponent's getting his king into the game. I'm not great at figuring out the move order. Like, I probably should have pushed this pawn first, or maybe, yeah, probably should have pushed this pawn first. Right? Because then my opponent, notice they can't approach here, they can't approach here, and they can't approach here. So all of those squares are taken away, so the king can't approach. And then if they bring, I still have this, right? So like, I should have done that. But I decided that I was going to defend this pawn this way, defend my rook, so I don't have to worry about moving it. But that allows my opponent to push my king away. Now I can't ever push my h6 pawn, because my opponent captures and is way too fast for me to stop. So my h6 pawn is dead. My g pawn is dead. I mean, my h7. My h pawn and my g pawn are both dead in the water. And my opponent's king, if I give him a little wiggle room, now first off, he can't go this way, notice. He can't approach this way. The g pawn does a good job of stopping my opponent's king. But if he were to maneuver around, and he gets up underneath behind, or if this rook, right, if this rook somehow manages to break free and get down here and take care of that backward pawn, all of a sudden, this becomes a passed pawn that's dangerous. But this single pawn is doing a good job of stopping my twin pawns over here. So I get the heck out of the way, still defending as best I can. This is all a bit of a stalemate. But we have 3 connected passed pawns. Let's start pushing those babies. Notice my opponent can't attack that way, so he has to go up and around. And that's fine. That gives me time to, oh yeah, first off, what was this? Right. Let me back up one more step. From here, I want you guys to look at the queening square. Remember, we talked about the pawn promotion square. This pawn needs 1, 2, right, this pawn needs 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. So this square, if your opponent's king can get into this square, then that king can stop you from promoting the pawn. When my opponent moved his rook out of the way, he still has one more move to get over. I have one more move to defend. By pushing this pawn up, I am guaranteeing that it gets out of the way. My opponent's king cannot infiltrate. So all it does is, that was my mindset at the time, was, you know what, I'll just push the pawn. I have time to get underneath it if my opponent tries to go for some other shenanigans, right, which is what he does, if my opponent tries to go for other shenanigans, at least my pawn is not going to be chased down. If we have to trade rooks somehow, right, like this would be a good opportunity to trade rooks. Well, maybe not that way, but let's say if my opponent traded this way somehow. Oh, I can't take. At least my pawn would be fast enough to get there. So, all right. So I simply moved out of the way, hid behind my pawns. My opponent has to get back in time to defend, which they do. I just defend here. And now it's my opponent's job to use his king to put a second attacker on this pawn. So that way he can take, if he gets his king here, he takes, I have to take back, and then he takes the pawn. So, and then not only that, but now my opponent's king is over here on this side of the board against these pawns. So that's my opponent's job, which he starts to do nicely. Again, he wastes a tempo, though. I don't know what this is for. This does absolutely nothing except take away one square his king could move. Gives me a chance to start moving my pawns, and now my pawns are defended. So I have extra defenders on my passed pawns. My opponent is now going to come after my rook, but that's fine. I don't really care. From here, there is a strategy. I have connected passed pawns, backed up by a rook. My opponent only has a rook. He can't capture because it's defended. He has to move his rook out of the way. Again, he can't capture, so he has to move his rook out of the way, at which point in time, he's free to capture here because I queen. And unfortunately, there's nothing my opponent can do at that point. So that is one strategy. I know about this. I'm not confident in it, but I know about it. So I know that this pawn is going to push to b3, and I have time. My opponent's king is not nowhere close enough. So I waste the turn by pushing my outside a4 pawn, or my pawn to a4. Bleh, words, Joe, get your words right. So pawn to a4 simply prepares b3. I know b3 is coming. This is an unnecessary move. At this point in time, my opponent's going to take my rook. I'm kind of fine with it. I push b3. So if my opponent makes this trade, doesn't matter. King is way too far away. So my opponent has to back up. I continue to push just like I would previously. I could have wasted another turn with my outside pawn, but wasn't necessary. At this point in time, my opponent can either take and give me a queen this way, or he can capture and give me a queen this way. He captures, I get a queen that way, and now my queen is actually defending my rook. So, queen and rook versus a rook. The player with the queen is in a much better shape than the player without. There are some concerns, not a lot, all right? Not a lot, mind you. This game is pretty well in hand. I still have an outside passed pawn if I absolutely need it, but my king does not have any flight squares, and it is possible my opponent could try to box me in a little bit. So as I escape, I'm going to go ahead and escape from this pawn. I'm going to make sure that this king does not get trapped. Yes, I lose a pawn in the process. All right, maybe I just pick up a pawn this way. Maybe I just push. There's a lot of options. Unfortunately, there's more options than my opponent can handle. I go for the slow, methodical approach. I'm not good at endgames. Guys, we've talked about this. I'm not good at endgames yet. I need to study endgames, but right now there's so much more that I want to learn than just endgames. So I'm going to get to endgames, I promise. I decide to go the slow, methodical approach. This drives my opponent's king away. If I really want to, I can pick up here. I go the slow, methodical approach, just cutting my opponent's king off. He has moves, right? He has moves, so he's not in stalemate. At which point in time, my opponent is now going to look for a draw by repetition. So he's just going to keep trying to check my king to make a series of infinite perpetual checks that forces me to call the game a draw. How can I stop this? Well, I just use my rook. At this point in time, my opponent resigned the game because all I have to do now is hide here. If my opponent tries to check, I block. Now there's no more checks. My opponent either trades or maybe they go to try to, chase here. But I can then just start marching my rook and my queen. I can just march these guys and my opponent's dead to rights. Or I can push my own pawn because as soon as my opponent pushes here, I can just get my rook up to defend or even rook over here to defend. I mean, there's really nothing my opponent can do. So delete from here. But yeah, the idea here was, again, I'm staying out of this pattern. I don't want to get trapped behind this pawn at all. And I have a rook, so I'm just going to hide behind my rook, and then that becomes my wall. So my opponent sees this, that I'm going to hide. My next move is going to hide me up and away. So at that point in time, my opponent resigned. So we got the win. So this isn't this is not a good example of an Alekhine defense, an Alekhine, because my opponent doesn't play the known move set, and they pre-moved this other move that probably is a little bit weaker, but we still got some of the Alekhine patterns out of it, right? the undermining the structure, these trades that happen right in front of the queen. We did get the early queen trade, and then we just kind of went to a middle game from there. And fortunately, we see the dangers of, it was such a great example of connected rooks, right? These rooks never got connected. Connected rooks and a hungry pig on the second row. How absolutely devastating that became. Because my opponent, right up until this point right here, is up a pawn, right? In fact, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to 5. So my opponent is still up a whole pawn. But the game absolutely falls apart for him. Absolutely falls apart for him from here on out. And it just becomes, in fact, if we turn on the engine, the engine says I'm only got a 2-point advantage. But it's going to start just growing like crazy from here on out. And it's simply a matter of my opponent unable to hold my hungry pig at bay. And yeah, you can see the tactic I missed. Watch the evaluation swing to an 8-point advantage and then back down to a 4-point. Because instead of picking up 5 points of material, I only picked up 1 point of material. But you can see how now it's gone to a full 5-point advantage when my opponent was up a whole pawn at the start of this. So hungry pig along the back row, rooks unable to get connected, and connected past pawns. I mean, all did serious work in this game. So this was a fun one. It was a crazy one. And I appreciate you guys understanding about how my rating is probably going to continue to drop for a while. But that's okay. I'm okay with failing fast because it means that I can put out videos of things that I learn. All right, guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye.